not here. She had an announcement of some sort. So we'll let her do that after this lecture. We've had some wonderful lectures today, yesterday, the day before. And I think this one will complement them quite well, because the viewpoint that is implicit in some of these is quite different than this one. So we'll be talking about differences. We'll be talking about the labor market, a comparative perspective of both. We'll be talking about macroeconomic policies, particularly the fiscal policy. And we'll be talking about the effect of the Eurozone. And all of these were covered in a slightly different way until now. So this is an institutionalist perspective on all of this. So first of all, we're talking about comparative political economy here. What does that mean? What are we to compare? First of all, the macro level and the micro level. Obviously, a banality. Why am I even mentioning something as stupid as this distinction? Because paradigms are folded around this distinction. If you ask, neoliberalism is a term that we like to use in political science, and sometimes we mean to signify the dire, market-oriented mainstream in economics. So your own central bank officials, most of the countries. But they would never accept this as a term that covers them. They usually tend to describe themselves as neoclassical or new classical economists. This is a first thing that it's quite necessary to emphasize. You have studies showing the use of the word neoliberalism in articles. And they show quite clearly that people using the word neoliberalism tend to approach it from a very critical perspective. So this is sort of, if you want to speak to economists, to mainstream economists, don't use this word neoliberalism, because when they say neoliberalism, they mean something entirely different. They mean Chicago School, right? They mean Milton Friedman, monetarists. But if you're talking about the mainstream, and that is what was meant in many of these presentations, it's better to use either new classical or neoclassical, depending on the context. So, the monetarist perspective, or the neoclassical perspective, tends to approach the economy from the micro level. When they do their modeling, they will do the modeling from the level of the firm, from the level of the subject. Keynesian economics, in particular old Keynesian economics, approaches aggregates. So we're talking about a clear macro level. And new Keynesians, under the influence of this mainstream, model, these are called the dynamic stochastic general equilibriums, they model from the level of the subject. And you get completely different results. So this is a very, very, very important distinction. Are we talking about firms, or are we talking about aggregates? So here we'll be talking about aggregates, and most of these presentations talk about aggregates in one way or another. So when you're talking about unemployment in a country, this is an aggregate, right? If you were talking about how many employees were laid off in a specific firm, this would be talking about that firm on the micro level. And the questionnaire that was supposed to be a part of the summer school is designed to cover this gap, to give us some information on the micro level. So, is there a national economy? This is just some food for thought. All of you have a smartphone in your pocket right now. Or if not all of you, most of you. The resources for that smartphone came from Congo, came from Africa, it was assembled in China, parts of it were manufactured in the United States. So it wasn't, if you bought it in Poland, if you bought it in Ukraine, in Romania, and Croatia, you didn't buy a Croatian, Romanian, Ukrainian cell phone. You bought a global cell phone. So a relevant level for economy, obviously, is not national. It is global. Or it is local. Thomas Friedman tells us the world is flat. And by this he means a globalized world with all of these flows going in various directions. Richard Florida tells us, no, the world is spiky. Whichever indicator you want to use, urbanization, production, citations of academic papers, you get spikes, of course. Various cities across the world. So not successful states and unsuccessful states. Not a successful world or an unsuccessful world. No, successful cities or regions and unsuccessful cities or regions. And yet, all of us here, or at least most of us, and me in particular, assume that there is quite a bit to be learned from the national level. This is because, first of all, statistics in general exist on national levels, statistics that we can compare. And more importantly, regulation, important bits of regulation, exist and are formed on the national level. Of course, they may originate from above, from the EU. They may exist on the local level, but even the local level regulation will have to fit together with wider regulative frameworks existing on the national level. So this is what we'll be comparing. Institutional frameworks, institutional complementarities, or a lack thereof, on national levels. And this is the framework that we'll use. Varieties of capitalism project, wildly successful, now framed at the edges, granted. It's an approach within new institutionalism. It started with this book called Soskis, 2001, Economist Varieties of Capitalism. It developed quite quickly, and now it's not as popular as it used to be. The general idea of this approach, it is still, in my opinion, the best thing that we have, the best tool that we have to compare political economies. And the basic idea of this approach is that particular institutional arrangements, ways in which you solve your policy problems, ways in which you address the labor market, or the capital market, or even your fiscal policy, have positive externalities. And these influence, in turn, all of the other relevant institutional solutions. So, if you have a country which consistently uses liberal institutional arrangements, you have a country which captures the positive externalia of these institutions well. Or, if you have a country which consistently coordinates its institutions, protects its markets, Germany, Austria, Scandinavian countries, Japan, you have a country which uses these positive externalia well. And the original contribution, Lawrence Soskis, proposed 5 important institutional relationships. Corporate governance. How do you finance your firms? Do you finance them as they do in developed common law countries, so Canada, Ireland, United States, United Kingdom, New Zealand, Australia? These are LME, liberal market economies. Do you finance them in good part via the stock market? So they have to look at how their stocks fluctuate in order to plan their activities. Or do you have massive banks, which group 4 or 5 concerns, and so large firms, large groupations, invest their capital there and have a really long-term perspective. So it's not so much about stock prices or similar indicators. It's not about profit rates. It's more about this long-term perspective financing. This used to be more or less true for Germany, but various movements away from this in the past 10, 15 years suggest that this is more of an ideal type than it is a description of Germany. But this was the idea. So this is the first institutional arrangement. The other is industrial relations. How are wages set? We had an excellent, actually we had 2 excellent presentations yesterday and today for Germany, for this particular thing. So here we'll be going very, very shallow. We'll be comparing different countries rather than explaining specific details within industrial relations. And interfirm relations, how do these firms communicate with each other, employees, and most importantly, vocational training and education. So let's take a look at how this functions. Okay, so this is an article 3 years after the first contribution. Here you have an index of ordination. Here you have various cases, so countries in specific years, which tend to gravitate towards liberal market arrangements. So here you will find Canada and Australia and the US and UK and so on. And these are their predicted growth rates. And here you have strategic coordinations. You have Germany and Scandinavian countries and Japan and so on. And you have their predicted growth rates. And in the middle, you can see very low, or well, it's not very low at all, but you see lower growth rates predicted for the countries that don't specialize so well. So they have a liberalized labor market, but they have a coordinated financial sector, or some combination of these. So this is, here you can see the general idea of this approach. So what can we learn about crisis reaction from all of this? Well, CMEs, again, most countries in continental Europe, basically, plus Japan, you have protected labor markets. You have long-term finance, and you have specific skill sets. What does this mean? This means that a firm will invest heavily in its employees. They will have various programs designed to educate the employees in order to work better at their workplace. When they get a job, the protected labor market will mean that there are not so many good incentives for them to get a layoff. So firms will tend to keep them, even if there is a crisis. And plus, of course, you remember they invested so heavily into them, so it's a valuable resource that you work. And you have long-term financing, so you don't have a jittery stock market that you need to obey in order to survive in the market. No, you have your own bank that has been investing in you for 40 years. So it's long term. And what would you expect from this when such a firm, in such a national economy, experience a contraction in the demand, so experience basically a crisis? You would expect to see slowly rising rate of unemployment in aggregate in such a framework. You would expect to see a greater loss of market capitalization because regulations supporting long-term financing will not be so much oriented towards protecting its shareholders. On the other hand, in Italy, you have flexible labor markets, which means if all of a sudden you have reached a point in your firm where your product is not in so great a demand, you can very easily lay off your workers. Severance pays are not so horrible. Notices are not so horrible. They're not so well protected. So it's not really a problem. Stock market financing means that once the demand drops, once your profit rates drop, once your stocks plummet, you will have to immediately start thinking about slashing and streamlining and making your own firm more attractive for investors. So there'll be a really short horizon for these decisions. And non-specific skill sets means basically that you have interchangeable workers. You didn't invest so much in them, so you don't really have an incentive to keep all of these. So, on a national level, you expect to see rapidly rising rates of unemployment, and you expect to see smaller loss of market capitalization. Sorry, market capitalization is the price of all of the stock, and here we'll just use a market cap to GDP ratio. So, which percentage of GDP is represented by stock prices. Okay, so does this check out? Can we see these movements? I've shown just 15 countries, the ones that you would find sorry, the ones that you would find here near the end. So consistently developing regulation countries, for these examples. And you see that it does check out. The correlation isn't at all bad for social sciences. This is the change of market capitalization to GDP from 2007 to 2010. And this is the investor protection index. So this index shows how oriented towards the protection of shareholders these countries are. And you can see that the more protected the shareholders are, the more interesting the market cap. So you can see this, that CMEs really had sharper contractions. So CMEs would be here, had sharper contractions in market caps to GDP, and the LMEs didn't have so much of a market contraction situation. You even see some that improved in these years. And does it check out for labor? Yes, it does. These employment protection legislation averages, again for 15 countries, it was that correlation. And you have change of unemployment from 2007 to 2010. So you can see that the protected labor markets tend to develop unemployment shocks more slowly in response to crisis. And to show you how this works, well, I had about 100 graphs for this, because this is research that I'm doing for other purposes, and I decided to try to bore you with this as little as possible. So I just chose some representative graphs for these, and most of them are, you'll see later on, the countries that you come from. So I wanted to show something that might interest you. You see the general idea here. We have two curves for each country. One of them is GDP growth. So you see a sharp decline in almost all countries in 2009. So in USA, this is real GDP growth, so it's corrected for inflation. In USA, you see a drop in GDP growth and a huge spike in unemployment, almost immediately. Look at this. From a bit over 4% to just under 10%. What's this? 1-2 years. And in Denmark, interestingly enough, this is basically where flex security takes you. Again, a relatively sharp and rapid growth. In Estonia, huge drop in GDP growth. Unemployment goes from under 5% in 2007 to over 15% in 2010. United Kingdom, well, here we don't have what we would really expect, but the growth that did occur was relatively rapid. If we showed the same graph for Ireland, you would see a huge spike. And here we have a bit more protected countries. You have Germany dropping, and this was very well covered, like I said, but I'll try to introduce another element later on into why. You have, of course, the trade market, the trade relations that intervene in the aggregate demand that your country experiences. And this was the main factor, in my opinion, in this continued drop in German unemployment. Here you have Belgium, a rapid contraction in GDP and almost no reaction to unemployment. Here you have Poland. The chart is dominated by this incredible success of reducing unemployment before the crisis. But in response to this drop, you see only a relative increase in unemployment. Ukraine, again, not almost unflinching. For me, the upper two are problematic because Croatia more and more resembles the curve for Greece. The only difference is that we had some success in combating unemployment before the crisis. But the thing to notice is that the growth of unemployment, if you take a look at Croatian GDP growth, this is very important. You can see that we never pushed out of the crisis. This is a continuing reduction of GDP growth. What does this mean? Each year, your GDP, your economy is smaller than the year before. And the next year is smaller than that. And the next year is smaller than that. So it's a continuing negative growth, continuing decline. Something similar happening in Greece. This is why these curves tend to be incremental. But in Croatia, you can see a growth that was not so rapid, not so large, but year after year after year, it adds up. Croatia had a relatively protected market at the beginning. In Romania, you see not a huge spike in unemployment. In Slovakia, you see an increase, but it's not so bad. Okay. So let's talk about macroeconomic policies. Varieties of capitalism proposes that the ways in which crisis is countered on the state level is also connected with these institutional complementarities. CMEs, coordinated countries, tend to have a more pro-cyclical aggregate demand management function. So what would you expect to see? Austerity. The idea is that the German national, completely natural reaction to a crisis would in fact be austerity. This is the surprising thing. And of course, it checks out more or less. The idea is that in LMEs, in liberal market economies, and I'll show you the data later on, you have discretionary, expansionary, anti-cyclical policies. And it's not so clear why this happens. The original author that proposed this, David Soskis, had two mechanisms to support his claims. And in my opinion, none of them checks out for this crisis, for the past 6 years. But his assumptions check out. So we don't precisely know why this is. And this is, again, about neoliberalism. Of course, you can say, well, UK is mainly a country adopting neoliberal policies and so on, and therefore, when we talk about austerity, this is a typical British reaction, but it's not. It's not. It's quite the opposite. This is, of course, interesting, and it's in fact obvious, because never does an economist or a group of economists have the power to change the institutions of a country. This is very localized, like in Chile in the 1970s, or maybe the Soviet Union at the beginning. So let's change the world, let's change everything, let's make a radical break against everything we had. Usually, you have all these supporting institutions demanding certain incentives, demanding certain reactions from the state. And even if you have an opinion, if you're a new classical economist, and have an opinion about what your country should be doing, it's not necessarily the case that you will be able to push it through. You mainly won't be able to push it through if it's against various powerful interests. But with that said, European Union as such turned to austerity, as you well know. So after 2009, we have very, very unnerving policies in most of our countries. But okay, maybe just to clear out two things before we take a look at the data. You know, of course, that the GDP measures the size of the economy. And it's usually broken down like this. You have the government spending. In Europe, more or less normal, about 40%. You have the investment spending, so all of the businesses opening new firms, new concerns, so on. You have, sorry, I switched them around, you have C, the consumption function. So everything that you would spend on medicine, on jeans, on food, on alcohol, it goes into C, everything that individuals spend, everything they use, and of course, net exports. These make up the GDP. So, when we talk about fiscal policy, the Keynesian view